Welcome to episode 21 of the Civil War Breakfast Club, joined by my co-host wearing her hockey jersey, the goaltender from Goderich, Mary Fincher. I am Darren Weeks. Mary, how are you?
I'm good, Darren. How are you?
Superb.
For those listening, I'm wearing my Boston College hockey jersey.
Yeah.
Because Canada and USA are playing each other tonight for the gold, and I really don't care who wins, because either way, Boston College kids will win, because there's like BC students playing on both sides, including the Canadian, obviously the Canadian BC students.
Canadian. And I'm wearing my USA hockey jersey, and I just want them to beat those dirty Canadians and bring home the gold, whatever happens. There's bigger fish to fry. But it's a good thing. U.S. the World Juniors Hockey is tonight, the final gold medal game between your little silly little country up there and this country down here. So we'll see what happens. The game will be on later on tonight. So by the time this drops, we'll know. And I fully expect the Canadians to win, admittedly. But you know what? You never know.
Either way, I see myself as winning, because I'm cheering for the Boston College.
There you go. BC, gotta love those Eagles. But as we start episode 21, holy crap, 21 episodes already.
I know. It's crazy. So we've been at this for I was thinking about it tonight, 5 months.
Every single week we've done one. We haven't missed a week yet.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. It was August the 9th that we finally came up with the name Civil War Breakfast Club. And with an hour of that, I had our Podbean account, our Gmail address, our Twitter account started, and our Instagram.
You are a rock star, Fincher. You are a rock star.
Can't do it without you, Weeks.
Well, you're a small one, but you're a rock star.
And anyway, now we have our website.
We have a website, civilwarbreakfastclub.com, so check it out. And we're going to talk about some different things here today. I know we get some business to take care of here with our mugs and stuff like that.
We do.
We're going to have some fun tonight, Mary. We're going to stay out west. I think this is almost like the Empire Strikes Back episode of this podcast, because we're going to talk about some Confederate victories. We're going to be talking about the beginning of the Vicksburg Campaign, which is going to talk specifically about Holly Ridge and Chickasaw Bayou. So we're going to do that and talk about that. So if you're a Sherman or a Grant fan, you might want to cover your ears on this one, because it's I promise it'll get better as the campaign goes on. But at this one, it's probably not going to be as good. So,
by the way, did you mean Holly Springs?
What'd I say?
Holly Ridge.
Oh, it's a golf course around here. Holly Springs.
We just headed that one out.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what happens.
That's like your Cape Cod. You used to call it the Cape Cod Breakfast Club or something like that.
Oh, God, we'd start this episode over again. Go Canada! Anyway, Holly Springs. Yes, my mind works. Anyway, all right. So, okay, enough. Hey, what are you drinking, Mare?
I am drinking Life in the Clouds, which is a double dry hopped IPA by Collective Arts Brewing Company, which is one of my favorite Canadian breweries. And the reason that I bought this is because, not only does the can have a moon on it, and I'm obsessed with anything with the moon on it because of the 11th Corps, but the artwork on it also looks like the guy might be biking through a swampy area or a bayou.
Look at you, a creative.
Yeah.
Okay. You got a mug game tonight?
I stopped at the Lickbo tonight.
Wow, big sprawl. Well, it is Tuesday.
Sherman.
Okay, Sherman. Okay, good call. I'm drinking, because of Grant, Cold Harbor IPA, which is going to be kind of representative of this effort for him today, unfortunately. I couldn't bear myself to find a Confederate mug, so I'm going with the old silvery Civil War soldier mug. But hey, speaking of Holly Springs, we'll talk a little bit about the West. We seem to have a lot of fun in the West. We came up with a really, really good podcast last week. And now we're going to kind of focus a little more on the Vicksburg Campaign, which is a long campaign.
That is. And the one thing to say, we just did Stones River last week, but this is something that is happening almost at the same time. As we talked about last week, Carter L. Stevenson's troops going to Vicksburg are a major reason why the Confederates lost that battle, because they'd lost all those men. But these are events that are happening almost simultaneously. Yeah,
so it's almost like, I don't want to say real time, but it's pretty close. So real quick, do a high level overview, as they say in my business world, about Vicksburg, and then we'll kind of drill down on Holly Springs, Mary. I can't believe you said Holly Ridge. But anyway, the Vicksburg Campaign, it really starts on December 29th, 1862, and ends on July 4th, 1863. It is a key strategic city for the Confederacy, right at the Mississippi River. Jefferson Davis was quoted. He says that Vicksburg was the nail that holds the South's two halves together. His peer, Abraham Lincoln, you may have heard of him. He says Vicksburg is the key The war can never be brought to a cease until that key is in our pocket. So right off the bat, you see how important this is. I mean, strategically, and a lot of people feel, myself included in a lot of ways, that the Vicksburg Campaign is the most significant campaign in U.S. American history as far as battle history. Vicksburg's blocked the Union from sailing down the Mississippi River. It allowed the Confederacy a communication line across the river to the western states. It helped them supply them for food and horses and mules and anything else you can come up with. It was strategically, defensively a powerhouse. It was the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Strong defenses, high hills. It's perfect for artillery. Area around it, as we'll find out, is just about impossible to get around.
It's like a hairpin bend almost.
Yeah, it's kind of like West Point in that regard. Surrounded by a bunch of small little rivers we'll talk about. The Yazoo we'll talk about. It's got a bunch of swamps around it. It's mostly wilderness. It's a real shitty place. You can't get by with large groups, horses. Basically, the Rebs defended it really, really well. I mean, before December, we got to talk a little bit about David Farragut's his Navy. So, he had approached the city in May of 1862, and he got turned back, and he went back to New Orleans, and Lincoln said, get back. Turn the boat around, go. So we tried again a month later and got pounded again. They couldn't deal with the rebel artillery. They just couldn't deal with it.
At the time that he was doing that, Farragut was having some health problems too, and he wasn't feeling the greatest. But he shows up to Vicksburg at some point and just demands the surrender. And the guy's like, nope, we don't do that here. See ya.
Yeah, he did. Ding dong.
And
sorry.
Like, nope.
No surrender here.
I'm not playing that fucking game.
No. They tried to dig that DeSoto Canal to go around the guns, and half the guys died of disease. And finally, a month later, July of 1862, they said, the hell with this. Everything was it was such an important thing. Politically, as we get into the fall of 1862, shit was going down too. Henry Halleck had just been promoted as general-in-chief of all the armies. One of the first things he ordered Mary was he ordered Grant to make that move on Vicksburg. He says, you got to take it. November 1862, he's like, go west, young man. You have to go do that. And right off the bat, it caused a domino effect that trickled down that all led to these battles.
It did, yeah. And the Vicksburg Campaign will have about 11 different battles, and it's Navy operations. There's different troop maneuverings. There's failures. There's drama and infighting that happens as well, as we're going to see. And I found a really good quote from Mark Twain, who describes the campaign. And he said, the war history of Vicksburg has more about it to interest the general reader than that of any of the other river towns. Vicksburg saw warfare in all its phases, both land and water, the siege, the mine, the assault, the repulse, the bombardment, success, captivity, and famine. It's everything, basically. And we are going to, just for our listeners, we are going to look at the early operations against Vicksburg that Farragut conducted at some point. We felt it warranted a separate episode rather than discussing it.
I would say a solid 3 episodes. So we're going to talk basically about the lead up to Vicksburg from December on, and we're going to stop after Chickasaw. And then eventually we'll go back to Farragut, and we'll talk about later on with Champion Hill and the mine and explosion. We're going to do it all, but today we're going to focus on this. But before the battle starts, we do have to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that was going on in Washington heading into this fall too. So we mentioned before, Henry Halleck had been promoted general-in-chief of the armies. He tells Grant to move on. John Rawlins, who was a longtime aide to Grant in the war, and later he was part of his cabinet, I think the Secretary of Defense, I think he was. He got a report that there was large numbers of Midwestern recruits that were being reporting to Cairo, Illinois. They were going to be under the command of one John McClernand. McClernand's a Democrat from Illinois. Basically, he's a politician in an Army's uniform. He was a subordinate to Grant before. He was at Fort Donelson. He was at Shiloh. But he was not liked.
Also friends with Abraham Lincoln as well. Lincoln does him a lot of favors, I think, but the one reason that Lincoln gives him he promotes him to being brigadier general, but at the outset of the Civil War, McClernand raised a bunch of troops for him. He needed a Democrat, he needed to hang on to a Democrat, and McClernand was that. So this is a completely political thing that Lincoln is doing with this. But yeah, Grant doesn't like him because he's politically appointed. The other reason Grant doesn't like him is because McClernand has a tendency to brag about his exploits, but at the same time, he brings others down. Like he kind of elevates himself, but then, diminishes the role that others might have had. That is one thing Grant does not like about him.
Well,
which I found interesting.
Grant, as we know from other battles, anybody who seems to be popular or seems to be some sort of rising star in the Washington's mind, Grant's got an issue with. We talked about that, but this one's a little bit different. Halleck tells Grant point blank. He says, and I quote, "The enemy must be turned by a movement downriver from Memphis, where they were, as soon as sufficient force can be collected. And so Grant gets this order. He goes, what the friggin' hell does that mean? Force being collected? You talk about these recruits. I mean, who's in charge? Am I in charge? Is this McClernand in charge? Is Sherman in charge? Was Halleck in cahoots with McClernand to usurp his command? So all these things are going through Grant's mind. But Grant gets clarification from Halleck, and Halleck says, no, you're in charge. You're in charge of the troops in the theater. And so Grant says, okay, ding, ding, I got it. Fast forward to November 20th, 1862. This is when Grant kind of decides what he wants to do. He wants to stay within those guidelines that Halleck gave him. But at the same time, he wants to stay ahead of McClernand, right? Yeah. So he tells Sherman to basically go into motion from Memphis. He wants to link up with him somewhere near Vicksburg is what he wants to do. If they combine their armies, it's around 40, 50,000 or so. If they combine and they get there. So Grant's going to go to a place called Holly Springs, Mary, not Holly Ridge, okay? He's going to go to Holly Springs, which is right near Oxford, which is a college town down there in the Mississippi area. He's going to get down there early December 12/5, 12/6, right around there, 1862. And because he gets down there, Grant does, and he really has no resistance. He's also getting suspicious of McClernand at the same time, too. So he tells Sherman, stay up there back in Memphis. I want you to organize these new recruits, okay? And for these guys that are earmarked for McClernand, I want you to get them. And I want you to train them and get ready. And then we're going to have you come down.
Bit of the backstory behind McClernand and this feud between him and Grant, it actually goes back to the Battle of Belmont. And that's where McClernand's men they ransacked the Confederate camp after they thought the Confederates had retreated. And then McClernand proceeded to start making a victory speech. The Confederates counterattacked. And then there was issues at Fort Donelson too. So it's not just this whole, he's a political general, but he's in Grant's eyes, he's fucked up along the way. But to your point, yeah, Grant is trying to stay ahead of him. So he's got this kind of two-pronged attack plan with Sherman to not only try and take Vicksburg, but he's also trying to keep ahead of McClernand as well.
Right. So he wants Sherman basically to jump on the boats, and he's going to have him steam down the Mississippi. Just fast forward the overall game plan. He basically wants to have Sherman attack from the river, down the Yazoo River, and attack the northern part of the city. Meanwhile, what Grant wants to do is he's going to be in Oxford, which is about 25 miles northeast of where Sherman's supposed to be. He's going to attack there, hoping to drag some of Pemberton's troops to Oxford to weaken the Yazoo so Sherman can attack a smaller force. In a nutshell, that's kind of what happens. But he saw this, Grant did, as fulfilling of Halleck's orders because that's ultimately what he wanted to do. And we'll get into some details. But before we do, we got to talk about the other team, Mary, because they're going to be
who's in charge there now.
It's going to be John C. Pemberton.
Pemberton, who is he's a northerner from Pennsylvania, and he married a southerner, and that's why he ends up fighting for them. In the early days of the Civil War, General, God, am I getting his name right? Scott.
Winfield Scott?
Yes.
I'm here to help her.
I kind of blanked. I'm like, I know the guy, I picture him. I've said his name a million times. General Scott calls him to Washington to offer him a command in the army, and Pemberton's like, nope. And he fights for the South because of his wife, and his wife is from Virginia, and she writes him, and she says, Jeff Davis has a command for you. And that's basically what happens. He has this lackluster service, and Miller in his book about Vicksburg says that his northern birth and upbringing, along with his lackluster service record, made him a strange choice to command the only Confederate army protecting Vicksburg. But we'd see Davis's track record with his commanders, and somebody like Pemberton is not a shock.
Pemberton, interesting dude, like you mentioned, he's from Philly. He's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So West Point, class of 1837. He was the roommate, Mary, of George Gordon Meade. So I bet there was some good stories there. But as to your point, he ended up joining the Confederacy because of his wife from Virginia. So he had a tough time with that one. Another situation with that one. He does a pretty good job here. He has limited troops. He's limited what he needs to do. But you know what? He's nervous. You know why? Because he's starting to get reports that Grant's moving. He's moving south, and he only has 6,000 guys covering Vicksburg. So he's getting reports from Earl Van Dorn. We'll talk about here a lot in here a little while.
I'm looking forward to discussing him.
Well,
I've got some information about Van Dorn.
Definitely. There's a couple of barns in his life, I'll tell you. But he's reporting an impending invasion by Grant. He's a cavalry guy. We'll talk in detail about him in a bit. But Pemberton's nervous, so he orders Van Dorn, who was at Holly Springs at the time, to fall back to a place called the Tallahatchie River, which is just north of Oxford. Sounds like a real happening place. And set up a defensive line there, and then basically go behind a place called the Yolabusha River in a town called Grenada, which is midway right on the Tennessee-Mississippi border is kind of where it is. And he's going to basically tell him, look, we're outnumbered like 3-1 here, and we have no chance against Grant, especially if he starts flanking us. We can't make him do it. We're not going to be able to do it. So he's going to say, well, I need to get some troops. First place he asks is he asks a guy named Lieutenant General Theophilus Holmes in Arkansas, a fantastic Starbucks name, Mary, by the way.
that is perfect.
Keep that one in mind, okay? He goes to him, and he says, listen, you guys aren't doing anything because you're just sitting there. Can I get some troops? Holmes says no. You know why? Because he hates Pemberton. So he has a quote he writes, Pemberton has many ways of making people hate him, and none that inspire confidence. Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a nice day. That's a Hallmark card right there. So
then Pemberton goes to Braxton Bragg.
Well, he goes to, he goes
to Davis and Johnston.
He goes, this is where it's funny is we get to crossover now.
Yeah.
Go back in the Wayback Machine to last week. He goes to Davis. Davis is like, all right, listen, I got this pain in the ass situation brewing. I got to go visit this friggin' Bragg. I'm going to come down. So he's going to basically come down. So he decides before I do, he goes, I need to put an adult in charge in this whole area. So he puts Joseph E. Johnson in command of what they call the district forces in the West. He's recovering from his wound on the peninsula that led to Robert E. Lee rising there in the East. And shockingly, Johnson doesn't want to go. He's like, kidding me? No way. He basically says, listen, you can conduct the war any way you want out there. No one's going to stop you. But he makes a mistake, though, because he gives him control from the Alleghenies west of the Mississippi River. That's it, which does not include Theophilus Holmes' troops in Arkansas.
They're in the Trans-Mississippi.
Right. So Holmes is like, I'm not fine. I already told you no. I'm not. No. So so again, it's a mistake on Davis's part because you're trying to get soldiers, but he kind of gerrymanders it away where he can't get those guys from Arkansas.
So Bragg ends up having to send Carter L. Stevenson's troops to Vicksburg, which is, as we discussed last week, why Stones River was most likely lost.
Right, it's exactly what it is. He's all tied together. So Davis, he's getting pressure to come visit anyway because he's got to go see Bragg. But there's a Mississippi senator by the name of James Phelan. He says, "Listen, shit's getting bad here, Mississippi. The morale sucks. You might want to come down." So he sends him a letter, and he writes to Davis. He writes, "Enthusiasm has expired to a cold pile of damp ashes." Okay, if ever your presence is needed, this is the hour. That's what he says to Davis. And Davis is like, shit, now I have to freaking go. So he's going to go. He travels to Mississippi. I'm going to go satisfy Phelan, but I got to deal with Bragg. Right around now, he's getting news of Fredericksburg, and he's all excited because, oh, my God, we got this battle, so he's feeling pretty good now. So he meets with old Braxy in Murfreesboro, like we said last week, to deal with all that infighting, and he meets with him. And this is to your point, Mary. He says, listen, I'm getting pressure from Pemberton. Holmes isn't giving me any guys. I need to take Carter Stevenson from you and send him to Vicksburg. And it's funny how it's the other side of what we talked about last week, right? Yeah. So now Carter Stevenson's 8,000 division is going to be sent to Pemberton to Vicksburg that we'll hear about later on.
Braxy loses all those troops, and they end up going help Pemberton out in Vicksburg. One thing that I do want to mention too is Earl Van Dorn was actually in charge in Pemberton's role, and he just kept fucking up.
Well, he had that real bad situation, Mary, because he was in charge of Vicksburg.
Yeah.
Where he put that martial law order in.
Yeah.
And he basically said, you know what, I'm in charge, martial law. And they were like, up yours, martial law. And they ran him out on a rail. So it's funny. Now he ends up kind of, I don't want to say saving the day, but here he comes again. Part two, the search for Curly's gold.
He's been demoted. City Slickers is a great movie, by the way, but I've never seen the sequel. I did catch that reference.
Oh, you miss a lot of stuff, man. I thought you might have missed that one. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Anyway, he's, I guess you could say, demoted. Like, he's not removed from the army, but he's demoted to being in the cavalry. Is now a good time to talk a little bit about Van Dorn?
You know what? It's all about you. Knock yourself off. No, Van Dorn, you're talking about him. Interesting cat. And we'll go back to some other stuff, but absolutely, Van Dorn is a guy who we'll be talking about throughout this. And he's definitely one of the more colorful people in the entire war, without a doubt. Yeah,
he's graduated 52nd in his class of 56. In 1842. He starts off in Texas. He's briefly in Virginia for the Civil War before being transferred to the West to command the Army. The Trans-Mississippi Theater, gets his ass kicked at Pea Ridge. Then he gets transferred to the Army of Mississippi and then he gets kind of quote unquote demoted to the cavalry. You've told the story many times alive. He ends up getting shot and killed on May 7th, 1863 for taking some guy's wife to the bang barn one too many times.
Well, they say he was looking for love in all the wrong places, Mary. No doubt about that, as they say. So he ended up hooking up with a woman named Jessie Peters, the wife of a doctor named George Peters. He gets himself in trouble, so George Peters, the doctor, finds out about it, goes to his headquarters in a place called Spring Hill, Tennessee. This is May of 1863, and he says, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you sign my pass? I want to get through the Confederate lines. I want to go out for a while. The guy's like, sure, no problem. Signs the pass, and then he pulls the whole Indigo Montana on him, kills him, and then uses the pass to escape throughout the line. And that's the end of Earl Van Dorn. You know, you mentioned he had the real shitty experience at Pea Ridge. He was at 2nd Corinth, didn't do anything. He was a very, very mediocre guy in every aspect of his life. Bad. School wasn't that great at West Point, not great in battle. Although we're going to find out here, this is Holly Springs is probably his high point.
This is the high point of Van Dorn's career.
You know, going a little bit back to the campaign. So we're talking mid-December of 1862. The plan, again, is Grant's going to come down first. He's going to set up camp. He's going to try to get Pemberton to pull troops away to Oxford. And then Sherman's going to come steaming down the river, kind of go up the Yazoo River. He's going to send up the old Yazoo, Mary. And then he's going to attack the city, hopefully with a weakened force. But what he needs on both sides, but especially the Union, they need secrecy. They don't want anyone to know what's going to be going on. And this is a mistake the Union makes, is about a couple of weeks before this whole thing goes down, they send the USS Cairo down, and it gets sunk by a mine or a torpedo, a place called Haynes Bluff, right along the Yazoo River. But you know what this does? It freaks up Davis, freaks out Pemberton, because they know the Union's close and they're probing. So any sort of complete secrecy kind of goes out the window with the Cairo. They still try to sneak it past them, but they knew that there's a reason why that gunship was patrolling there. And what they were doing was they were going to basically bombard the guns on those heights, and that was going to be setting up the initial assault. So it kind of took a little bit of the jump away, but again, it ended up kind of not really working anyway. So Pemberton's nervous, right? He's going to basically decide what we're going to do, and Van Dorn basically decides with a couple of guys from Texas that they want to be a little aggressive. So he's sitting down there by the Yolubusha River, how you pronounce that, you know, easy for you to say, and he has a plan. He wants to take his cavalry guys. He wants to handpick basically 3 brigades, around 3,000 troopers in the cavalry, and he wants to go up to Holly Springs. And what he wants to do is he wants to ransack the supplies. He wants to mess them up so there's no supply lines. If he destroys their food, their supplies, their weapons, they know Grant has to go back to Memphis. He has no choice. Yeah. He's going to have to quote you, have to leave the dance floor.
Yeah, and he's going to have to leave it pretty quickly. And this raid was, as you said, it was actually Texas cavalry officer John S. Griffith who suggested to him. And Miller basically says of Pemberton that he does not possess strategic acuity. So he's like, okay, let's
I get that a lot too. It's okay.
But so there's going to be a total of 3,500 Confederate cavalry that will ride in from Grenada. And they managed to go around the Union at Oxford. They managed to sneak by the cavalry that Grant had out looking for them, because he was expecting this, but they managed to sneak by him. Before entering the town, Van Dorn divides his forces, has some of the forces on the road leading south from town, and they're posted there to prevent reinforcements from reaching Holly Springs, because he's trying to cover all his bases in this. Like, he literally wants to make sure they destroy everything they've got there. Now, going back a little bit, when the Union arrived in Holly Springs, the citizens, which are mainly women, they are not happy to see them at all. And on this march to Holly Springs, the Union troops, they're doing shit they shouldn't be. They're taking stuff from farms. They're basically being like the bummers on the March to the Sea, except there have been no orders for them to do that at all. So they're not really earning a good reputation for themselves as they're going through the countryside here. And apparently the worst offenders were the 7th Kansas Cavalry, who apparently, like, they would smash windows in houses. There was one girl, I think she was a teenager, Cordelia Lewis Scales. Her family had a plantation near where the Union would have been passing by, and she said, "It makes my blood boil to think of the outrages they committed." They're not going into a place where they're welcome at all. December 19th is when Van Dorn's men are getting close to reaching there. December 20th is the day that the raid on Holly Springs happens. And it is also referred to for a while after in Holly Springs as the Glorious 20th. Because the citizens were so fucking happy to see Van Dorn
It was,
the women were happy to see Van Dorn.
I bet they were.
That was probably the greatest day of his
happy
life.
to see them too. Tell me about it. No wonder they had to order so much ice, But Van Dorn, he wanted, it was funny because he made a mistake. Well, it could have been a mistake. He left his artillery behind because it was going to slow him down, which is what got him in trouble at Pea Ridge. He had no support. They didn't have the best guns either. They had a lot of shotguns and a lot of silly guns like that. Not really Spencers or anything really good. But he wants to do this shock and awe thing. He wants to roll through there. She mentioned he's got 3 brigades. He's got some Texans under John Whitfield. He's got some Tennesseans under William Hicks Jackson, and some guys from Arkansas, Mississippi, and Missouri from Colonel Robert McCulloch. It's interesting because they're marching through a lot of shitty weather too. The weather is an ongoing aspect for this battle because of this whole campaign, I guess it is, because it's cold and drizzly and crappy.
This is
it's
late
December.
in the campaigning season too. It's like we said about, Stones River is a very rare late winter battle that happens. And this is what's happening here too.
Van Dorn's line is 3 miles long. That's how many guys he has, right? And to your point, they're staying as far east. The whole thing's based on secrecy. So they're staying 30 miles east. They don't want to get seen. Grant is oblivious to this point. He's still back in Oxford. Sherman at this point is still back in Memphis. He's basically Grant's planning for Sherman to come down, like we said before, in kind of dual-pronged attack to deal with it that way. It's funny, around this time, I guess we have to mention this, man. We got to talk about Special Order 11, right? At least for a second, okay? Because it was right on December 17th. This was all going on when Grant had that really bad order that he ordered all the Jewish people ejected from the area from trading cotton, and it would haunt him for the rest of his career, including his presidency. Lincoln ultimately ended up overturning the whole thing after some consulates came up to Washington and said, what the hell is this guy doing?
Lincoln was pissed about it because, there were Jewish people fighting in the army, and the issued, as you said, on December 17th. The Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department are hereby expelled. So Grant is like, you're gone. Get out of here. And
within 24 hours, he wants them gone.
Yeah, and part of this came from Sherman was complaining about it. He was saying, I found so many Jews and speculators here trading in cotton that I have felt myself bound to stop it. But another reason they say that Grant issued this order is his father, Jesse, came down to try and get his son to do him a favor. And Jesse is representing, I think it's Mack and Brothers, a Cincinnati Jewish clothing manufacturer. And Jesse had promised to get a 25% return on the profits, cotton. And he's coming down to completely take advantage of his son's position in this. And Grant is like, nope, you're gone, sends him packing. So there's a few different reasons why they think Grant would have done this, but it will, as you said, it will haunt him until his presidency.
All the way through. It is, but again, that's an issue we mentioned primarily because it happened right when this is all going on. Just the dates just kind of line up. So Van Dorn, like I said, he's trying to be secret. He's trying to be quick. He doesn't allow his guys to light fires because he's afraid of the Yankee patrol seeing him. They pass through a village, Mary, called Pontotoc. They're heroes. They're offering these guys whiskey and all this stuff. And to Van Dorn's credit, he says, you know what? Nope, ain't got time. We got to move through, which is something to think about Van Dorn. He turns down, it sounds like a pretty good time. And eventually,
he knows the ladies are waiting for him in Holly Springs.
Tell me about it. Eventually, what happens, though, is they do get spotted. The Yankee cavalry does finally see him. One of the scouts sends a message to Grant, which gets all fucked up, and he'll get to him later, but they do get spotted. So we're getting close to the same dates, but right around the 19th or so before the 20th that you mentioned, all these Union soldiers are encamped. They're having preparing for a big Christmas holiday dance at Holly Springs. I don't know how kind of fun that would be. But Van Dorn at this point is only 30 miles away, so he's not far. This is where you get lucky. Speaking of speculators, cotton. He catches 3 northern speculators, Van Dorn does. He steals their clothes, and he steals their passes. And he dresses up 3 of his troopers and gives the passes, I want you to go to Holly Springs and go see what the hell they're doing. So they walk right into the town. No one even questions them because they got the pass and they got the clothes. And they come back and say, dude, they're fucking partying. We got them, right? And so they're having a great time. And so there's no resistance. More importantly, they suspect nothing because the whole thing is based again on secrecy. So now Van Dorn's like, well, here we freaking go.
But the funny thing about all this is the fact that Grant has sent telegrams, all the commanders that are in posts along the way, including Colonel Robert C. Murphy, who is at Holly Springs. He gets the telegram during this party, and he basically ignores it. Alcohol might have been involved in that. Not 100% known, but maybe, I don't know.
Maybe, or call me maybe.
Yeah. Probably call me. I think Murphy is getting close to call me maybe at this point, but he basically is like, this isn't fucking happening, and he stays at the table and keeps drinking.
So Murphy, real quick. So he gets the report from Grant, because Grant finally gets, I mentioned before, he finally gets that report from these scouts I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
He doesn't think they're Van Dorn. He thinks they're from a guy named Red Jackson. That's who he thinks it is. Red Jackson's cavalry. That's what it said. So he tells him, listen, you're getting impending shit about to happen. And he goes, that's cool. I'll let my guys know. And he goes back to bed. To your point, the next morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, knock, knock, knock. Who's at the door? But a slave. And he says, hey, I don't know if you want to know this, but there's like a whole shit ton of Red cavalry people coming. And he's like, oh, okay. Thanks for letting me know. Let me telegram Grant and says the guys you told me about are here, but I'm going to go back to bed again. So he goes back to bed again. He wakes up and it's sunrise to the sound of gunfire. Now the shit's going down.
It's crazy. Like every cavalryman with Van Dorn has two things: turpentine and matches. And they, in 8 hours, managed to destroy the supplies. They burn the shit out of everything. The women, who are basically the only ones left in the town because there's not any men there because they're off fighting in the Civil War. But the one thing they do destroy there is the 3-story Masonic building.
Yeah, well,
yeah,
strange. But so mention the women. So it's sunrise. Picture Van Dorn. They're rolling through the town. They're screaming with that rebel yell, yip yip yip. They're making typical cavalry. The soldiers are still in their tents. And they're getting out and they're just running. One soldier in Van Dorn's guys says, "Some ran all the way to Memphis." That was some of the quotes they said. You had the local women, to your point, cheering. They're out the windows yelling, "Kill them all, kill them all." Sounds like a fun place. You don't have to listen to that old Metallica album, one or the other, And so Murphy, you mentioned him, he gets caught in his house. He's still wearing his nightshirt, probably with his Holly Springs hanging out, probably. And he gets arrested. There's all kinds of rumors about how they captured Julia Dent Grant. They arrested her, which is kind of an urban legend.
Her and Jesse had got out the night before and were headed towards Grant because they were staying at Holly Springs, but they had left on the 19th before Van Dorn got there.
But to your point, they use that turpentine and the matches liberally. I mean, they burned out. They find all the supplies. That was don't forget, that was their target, was the supplies. They find all the supplies in a place called Depot Street, which happens to today now be called Van Dorn Avenue. Funny how that works out. They find a bunch of shoes. They find a bunch of food, weapons. They burn it. They take all the stuff. They steal the guns. They're sticking pistols in their pockets. But you know what they find, Mary? Whiskey and cigars.
Yep, and they're smoking the federal cigars. They're walking around smoking
the cigars. They're drinking the whiskey, and Van Dorn's like, fine. They're definitely enjoying that.
It's so embarrassing for the Union, though, when you think about it. And there's one of these cavalry officers from the Confederacy. His last name is Dupree. He says that the rebel cavalry after this was the best equipped body of cavalry in the Confederate service. Every trooper had from 2 to 6 pistols, 1 or 2 carbines, one or more sabers, and all the ammunition, rations, blankets, shirts, hats, boots, overcoats, etc. his horse could carry. They took what they could carry, and then they burned the shit out of the rest.
They did. They absolutely destroyed it. So they set boxcars on fire that were full of clothes. What they did too is they were smart because they knew it looking over their shoulder that these guys were not going to be here. These guys are coming. So they cut the telegraph lines for like 11 o'clock. Grant's trying to reach them and he can't, which is a bad feeling when you can't reach somebody and you're worrying about them. Basically what happens is now he's starting to get a little concerned. So about mid-afternoon, there's smoke pouring out of Holly Springs and the buildings, everything's going, including Julia Grant's new carriage, Mary. They burn her new carriage, Van Dorn's now going to send scouts in all directions to look for Union soldiers. He's going to tear up the tracks. He's basically going to sit there and say, okay, it's mid-afternoon, 3, 4 o'clock. He says, you know what? We're done. Mission successful. A couple of things he does, though. He bags all 1,500 guys. He catches them all, including Murphy. He captures them all. But he can't take them with him, right? It's like Ebenezer Creek. No. So he has to parole them. So this is where Murphy really screws up, by the way. He agrees to sign the parole. What Murphy should have known was they can't take us. So they're gonna, if we don't sign the parole, they're going to say, fine, fuck it, just go. What the hell? But he signs it, which means they cannot fight again until they're exchanged. So this takes 1,500 guys away from Grant that he could have used on this campaign because Murphy did not think more than 5 seconds. He's just grabbed and said,
he was probably still drunk from whatever he was doing the night before.
Probably still had his nice shirt on. So they destroyed, almost $2 million of 1862 money worth of supplies. dealt a real kick in the nuts to Grant, because it's almost like a Five Forks situation for him.
It's really, this is another thing that I realized in studying this. Like, I've looked at the Vicksburg campaign before. We covered it last year on Real Sorter podcast, but we looked more at Chickasaw and just briefly at Holly Springs. But when you look at Holly Springs, it's one of these things that it's a lot more important than what it's made out to be. It has a huge impact on, it changes things in the Mississippi. It literally fucks up Grant's two-pronged plan that he had with Sherman, because not only do you have Van Dorn doing what he's doing in Holly Springs, but you've got Nathan Bedford Forrest doing shit too. That's fucking things up as well.
He's doing more supplies. He's got those squirrel guns and those old shotguns. He's got the real shitty stuff, Bedford Forrest. But so Van Dorn, he's going to go ride north. He's going to go try to connect up with Forrest and go whatever they're going to do. Grant is getting killed on the press for this now. They're ripping him for this. Because now his supplies are completely gone. He knows he has to go back to Tennessee. He's that's it. But the problem is, jumping on the boat up in Memphis is Sherman. Because of shitty cell connections in Tennessee, he doesn't know what's going on in Holly Springs.
And Grant sends him a message that tells him that because they had planned to be at a certain place at almost the same time to do what they were going to do with this two-pronged approach. And Grant sends him a message that says, I'm not going to be there. And Sherman never
doesn't get it.
Message. Now, Sherman gets word, we'll discuss this in a few minutes, he does get word of Van Dorn's raid, but because he doesn't have actual confirmation from Grant, he continues on with his plan.
Yeah, I mean, he has no choice, but he has his orders. So he has no idea what's going on at Holly Springs, and he has 4 divisions. So now we're talking about Sherman, of course. 32,000 guys on 12/19, the day before the big raid. So right around the same time, he's going to arrive at the Yazoo River, which is just north of Vicksburg, on Christmas Day. His plan was flawed. With the Grant thing changed everything. He thought he was going to surprise Pemberton. He thought Pemberton still only wanted 6,000 guys. He didn't know that Stevenson was coming, who hadn't arrived yet, admittedly, and he didn't know that the guys who were going to be used to attack Grant were on their way back too. So he thought he was fighting 6,000 guys. He was going to catch completely by surprise, because Grant was going to be pinning down Pemberton along the Yolobusha River, and he was wrong on both. So he's going into this already fucked. What he's doing is he's walking into a buzzsaw. He doesn't know it yet.
No, he doesn't. And he issues, it's on December 23rd. That is the same day that Grant tries to warn him and it doesn't get to him. Sherman issues orders to his 4 division commanders, George A. Morgan, a guy named A.J. Whiskey Smith, who apparently enjoyed whiskey.
Well, how do you know? Maybe he didn't.
M.L. Smith, and a guy named Frederick Steele, who sounds like someone that would be going to the Bang Barn quite a bit.
I wonder if old AJ, if he did 1 shot of bourbon and put him out for the night too. I wonder if that's how that works. It's funny how that. But so
he gives them a hand-drawn map of the Vicksburg area too, and basically tells them what they're going to be doing.
While this is all going on, Pemberton he's like, okay, now he's still nervous, but he's feeling better. So he's hearing from his scouts that Grant is in fact retreating.
Yep.
This isn't a Wheeler situation back at Stones River where he's mistaken. He knows he's retreating. Yep. He knows he's going back. And now he knows he can redeploy his troops from that Oxford, Holly Springs area back down to deal with Sherman. Sherman, meanwhile, we mentioned before about the Cairo. But now the Rebs know Sherman's coming, but they don't know where he's going. So they know he's going to be coming down the Mississippi at some point. They know roughly what the deal is, but they just don't know. Pemberton transfers 3 brigades from the Yavalusha to north of the city around a place called Chickasaw Bluff. Got that one right. The terrain we mentioned at the beginning is brutal. Now you got to think eventually Sherman is going to have to land. He's going to have to march his troops overland to get to Vicksburg. So it's completely, it's swampy. It's impossible. Swamps, snakes, clowns, forests, everything's in those woods.
It's all tangled, and some areas are really narrow to the point that they would only accommodate 2 troops walking through it. So Pemberton basically orders this guy, Stephen Dill Lee, who's been tasked with the defense at Chickasaw. He's a West Point graduate. He's 29 years old. He's friends with E.P. Alexander, our good friend E.P. Alexander.
He is. He certainly is.
So he has written him in November saying that the Yankees can never take Vicksburg. Our batteries are too strong. And so he is charged with the defense of this. So he's placing artillery and he has rifle pits on like kind of an elevated table of land. So I would imagine it to be a little bit like how Lookout Mountain was. So there's that kind of like that, just that flat area where he's able to place rifle pits and artillery. In some ways they are vulnerable here, but in other ways they have many advantages. As the Yazoo flows towards the bluffs, it splits left and right in forming a Y. And it is here that Lee places field guns and sharpshooters on the flanks of this triangle. It's going to be an absolute, as they call it, slaughter pen.
It is. Ooh. Slaughter pen. But it's going to be a situation that's brutal. Sherman, fast forward to December 21st, a couple days before Christmas, he's still on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi, and he's going to slowly start to move his way down. Rebel spies are all over the place looking for him. Christmas Eve, finally, they find out what his plan is. This is when the whole thing kind of unravels for Sherman. And this is, again, by happenstance. So on Christmas Eve, there are 2 rebel guards who are playing cards in a building and along the river just north of Vicksburg. All of a sudden, this small black girl comes running in and says, "This steamboat's coming." They look out and they see 7 Yankee ironclads followed by countless transport boats loaded to the gills with Union soldiers coming down the river, okay? The guy's name is Major Lee Daniels. That's the guy who gets this word. He does a telegraph. By happenstance, Mary, he's the same guy. Telegraphed Jefferson Davis to tell him he was elected president of the Confederacy. Same guy, right? So he basically jumps on his horse and he rides full speed in the rain. I don't know if he was yelling, "The Yankees are coming, Paul Revere." So I don't know, maybe. It probably was. He finally gets to the station where the telegraph is, and he telegraphs a guy at a place called DeSoto Station. He's typing. You know what happens? Nobody answers. There's no one there. And so finally, a guy named Colonel Phil Fall answers and basically says, "Dude, what? What the friggin' hell? It's Christmas Eve. What the hell do you want?"
Because everybody's partying in Vicksburg.
Right. He tells him there's a bunch of boats coming, and this is a real deal. So Colonel Fall, now he's freaked out. So he ends up traveling again. It's rainy out. He goes to a house of a Vicksburg socialite named Dr. William Balfour. Now, this is a picture of those big plantations. They're all dancing. It's a big Christmas party going on. He's looking for a guy named General Martin Luther Smith. He wants to tell him what's going on. So he finds him. Smith ends the party, kicks everybody off the dance floor, Mary, and says, "Okay, this is it." Orders all the citizens, "Get the hell out of here. This is the real deal." But the Rebs now know that Sherman's coming and he's going to be going on the Yazoo River. So they know. So to your point, all those guns that Stephen Dill Lee had prepared, now they got them, right? They're just it's like fish in a barrel. So
and that's when he goes to prepare all this, is at this time. So he does it really, really quickly. Now it's funny, flash forward a little bit, after battle report, Sherman will talk about how fortified it was. And then Lee came back and said it wasn't that fucking fortified. Yeah. We had to throw that shit up in a few days. Like he's admitting it was quick.
Stephen Dill, after the war, I know we're jumping ahead, he was quoted as saying, "If he attacked immediately, we were fucked." But he didn't. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But Pemberton, first thing he does, he declares martial law in Vicksburg. I could see Earl Van Dorn going, "Fucking, I tried that. Didn't work." But he does it. And so now Stephen Dill Lee knows we're in a great spot because we know where he's coming from. By now, he's got about 2,500 guys. He's got 26 guns. But he's placing them. And he knows he's got the rifle pits. He knows Sherman has to come across in one of only 3 ways once he lands. A place called the Sandbar, a place called the Old Indian Mound, which sounds very scary. And there's another path that has no name, Mary. It's just an area that goes around Chickasaw Bayou. They didn't give it a name. They know that this is how they have to, because if that's where they're going to land, they think he's going to land at a place called Johnson Plantation, which Dill predicted, which is exactly what he did. On the 26th of December, 1862, he lands as predicted at Johnson Plantation. Now, he has 120 total boats and 4 infantry divisions. You mentioned the 4 guys, A.J. Smith Whiskey, Morgan Smith, Washington, and Morgan and Steele. So he positions them basically where he's going to take A.J. Smith, and he's going to basically be on the southernmost point, if you're looking at a map. And then he's going to take Morgan Smith, and he's going to be across opposite side of that Indian Mound we talked about, which is the base of Chickasaw Bluff. George Washington Morgan, he's going to be basically offloaded right in the plantation. And Frederick Steele is going to basically be along the northern bank of Chickasaw Bayou, where it kind of opens up into the Yazoo River. So he kind of has it set up in a way like a triangle, where the base of the triangle in the corner, like you can see what I'm doing with my hands, right? Because people listen. But picture a triangle. The sides in the bottom is where Lee is. The point, the top, is where Sherman is. So they're basically surrounded almost like a triangle. And so the way Sherman positions himself, he's basically on a peninsula or an island. He's got the rivers on both sides of him. He puts himself in a really shitty position. Now, the position is good if they don't know you're coming. Well, they know
Exactly.
you're coming. You're in a good position.
No, it's not. Like Miller says in his book about Vicksburg that it's an impossible place to fight to begin with, even if they don't know you're coming. But if you're like Stephen Dill Lee and you've done what you're supposed to do, and he's also got those sharpshooters at the kind of corners of that triangle, right?
He was pinned. Now, a couple that you mentioned, you hinted before. Sherman, he was really good at geography and topography. He had this map, or he must have bought one of those shitty maps at the gas station that doesn't fucking write. Because what the map showed is kind of a hand-drawn thing. It didn't show the terrain, and that was the key to the whole thing. It didn't show the swamps and the snakes and the clowns and all that stuff that's in those woods. It just basically showed point A to point B. So he just thinks, okay, it's going to march right across. That's what gets him in trouble, and he misread it. Admittedly,
that's not the first time. This will not be the last time that Sherman misreads a map either.
And the other bad thing that happens to Sherman, now we're talking about the 29th of December, is those troops I mentioned who are fighting Grant, now they're arriving. So this is 10,000 guys arrive for Stephen D. Lee. So now it increases his numbers. Now he has a 13-mile front of attack against these guys. So it's getting worse and worse and worse for him, because now Sherman, he's sitting there going, guys, I know I see him all too, but don't worry. Any second, Grant's going to start firing those guns, and we're going to see. Just wait, watch. He's sitting there, and he's like, any minute now. Then he's like, fuck. Then he starts to realize something's wrong.
He's like David in Schitt's Creek. This is fucked.
He's like, because he doesn't know that Grant has failed at this point. So he's expecting, let's just wait here. As soon as Grant attacks, they're going to have to pull troops away, and then we can move in. But it never happens because Grant's all the way back in Memphis at this point. It never happens. He realizes now, like a young Darren in the supermarket when his mother lost me, he was alone and he's scared, okay? And so he doesn't know what he's going to do. So he's going to have to attack. So he plans to have his divisions on their flanks, basically create a diversion. Mm-hmm. And the plan is use a diversion, and then he's going to basically try to attack the middle. So George Morgan's going to be in the 3rd Division. He's the guy who's going to be the one who's going to attack the center. So George Morgan, real quick, Mary, he went to West Point, but you know what he did at West Point? He flunked out. He didn't make it. But he told Sherman, he says, I got this. He says, and I quote, in 10 minutes, I'll be on those hills. That's what he told
Morgan
Sherman.
That you're talking about?
This is Morgan, right?
Oh my God. And Morgan came back later saying that he said to Sherman, we will lose men from this position. We will not take Vicksburg.
Yeah. So this is before and after. Okay. Yeah. This is kind of like the diet thing, the before and the after. This is with Morgan, except in reverse. So Morgan, a couple things he does wrong. He sets up pontoon bridges to go across this body of river. And you know what he does? He puts the pontoons over the wrong body of river.
Yep. It's such a clusterfuck.
So he finally realizes what he does, and he has to start moving these things. And now when he starts to move them, he starts getting hit by artillery and the sharpshooters you mentioned. So right off the bat, he's going to be screwed. So he's going to attack using 3 brigades, a guy named John DeCourcy, who, when he got his orders, literally said, my poor brigade. That's how confident he was.
I'm fucked.
He's like a guy named Francis Blair and some Iowans named John Thayer. So Sherman admittedly says, we're going to lose at least 5,000 guys here, but we're going to do it.
He said, we will lose 5,000 men before we take Vicksburg, and we may as well lose them here as anywhere else. And that's when Morgan is said to have responded, we will lose men from this position, but we're not going to fucking take Vicksburg.
The attack begins right at noon. It starts with artillery, like they always seem to do. Citizens in Vicksburg said it sounded like an earthquake was going on. The whole ground was shaking.
It's about 4 hours long, isn't it? This thing, I
don't know how long it was, but it was a while. It took a while. Sherman had 60 total guns at this. He actually had a lot of guns. But right off the bat, those guys I mentioned, DeCourcy and Blair, come under heavy fire right off the bat from canister fire. Their line falls apart almost immediately. Those Iowans from Thayer, they went in the wrong direction somehow. They went too far to the right and got lost.
It was just crazy what was happening.
So it's a comedy of errors right off the bat. A lot of DeCourcy's brigade, they did make it to Chickasaw Bayou, but they got pushed back by some Louisianans. Same thing happened to Blair. They had about 500-600 guys either dead or captured, but some did make it. I mean, they did make it. It's kind of, I think of it like Pickett's Charge in a way, right? They actually did make it, but they got against the bluffs and they were pinned against the bluffs because of the guns and they couldn't move. So using their hands. They're digging to the sides to protect themselves, and it's raining and
It's
it's
kind of
cold.
like what happens at Franklin, right? Too, like there's things that happen at Franklin as well. O'Connell, in his biography about Sherman, he describes it as like in repeated attacks, they were shot to pieces, losing 1,800 men. And then Sherman mercifully became convinced that the part of wisdom was to withdraw, that this was not something that was going to happen.
It took him a little while, though, because so while this is all going on, Pemberton, his cell phone rings, and Joseph Johnson says, hey, those guys from Stevenson, from Bragg, they're here. They're in Jackson. What do you want me to do with them? And Pemberton's like, I just send them all. I send all of them, as many guys as I can get. So they put them all on railroad trains. They sent them over. So that night, the feds are literally shivering in the cold with no blankets and along Chickasaw Bluff. Time goes on. Those guys from Jackson are coming. So they don't know that just yet. But you mentioned before, Sherman knows the writing's on the wall. At this point, he's lost like 1,800 guys, and the Rebs have lost less than 200. And he has that quote where Sherman says, our loss has been pretty heavy, and we accomplished nothing, which just sounds like the story of my life, Mary. But their ammo's running low. He sends David Porter back to Memphis to get more bullets because he's running low, and goes and gets 4 million more bullets. On how the hell you get 4 million bullets on a boat, but he did. But you know what he does though, Mary? Sherman, before you mentioned he decides to go, he says, you know what? Let's stick this out. Whether it was ego or to avoid criticism or want something positive, he says, you know something? I can't leave right now because this will be a complete and utter train wreck. So he's like, well, what if I use the Navy to bomb the Rebs again, to wreck those batteries right at daylight? So we'll sneak. What we're going to do is, basically I'm going to get my best 10,000 guys, and we're going to sneak over to a place called Snyder's Bluff under cover of darkness. And then we're going to attack, and they're going to be there, and we're going to be able to do it. So now the time flips. Now it's New Year's Day, and he's looking, he's ready. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. He puts those 10,000 guys on the boat. But you know what happens? It's foggy.
Yep.
And the boat guys can't see where they're going. So finally, they realize we ain't going to make it there until it's going to be like mid-morning by the time we get there. So we're going to be fucking screwed. We're going to be pounded. Finally, Sherman has that come to Jesus moment and says, fuck. He says, you know what?
Yeah, he realizes he withdraws to the mouth of the Yazoo River. And he said, I was forced to the conclusion that we could not break the enemy's center without being too crippled to act without any vigor afterwards. So he's recognizing that his troops are
you know what? It is Sherman's credit. He knows when he's beat. He says, I reached Vicksburg at the time appointed. I landed, I assaulted, and I failed. I mean, to talk about, how often that's up there with "That's all my fault" at Lee at Gettysburg.
Oh, yeah.
Say what you will about old Uncle Blingy, Mary, but he told it like it was, and
he admits it here. Like he said, I attribute our failure to the strength of the enemy's position, both natural and artificial, and not to his superior fighting. But as we must all in the future have ample opportunities to test this quality, it is foolish to discuss it. And he writes to his wife Ellen, well, we have been to Vicksburg, and it was too much for us.
Yeah. But while it's January 1st, and they're thinking, okay, what do we do? They hear the trains arriving from Jackson, the sound of the trains, the soldiers cheering, and the feds hear it too. And, and Sherman knew, he says, these are more guys coming. We don't know who they are. He knows Grant's going to be there. And he says, this ain't going to friggin' it. So he saw that's going to be the end of that. You think about Pemberton, right? If Vicksburg ended right here, he's a hero, right? He beats Grant and he beats Sherman.
Yep.
So he defeats both of them. He tells Jefferson Davis, he messaged him and he says, Vicksburg is daily growing stronger. We intend to hold it. So right now so when you wonder like later in the Vicksburg campaign, why Pemberton was so reluctant to leave it, I think the beginning of it's probably why, because he had so much confidence at the very beginning of it. And then Sherman, as if his day is getting friggin' worse, he hears that McClernand's arrived, and he's told by David Porter, oh, by the way, McClernand's here, and he ranks you, and he says he's taken over.
Yeah. McClernand, by that point, has already telegraphed Lincoln and said, left here by myself.
He's like, so he got ditched, but the whole thing fell apart. And what it really did, this was the third real attempt to try to affect Vicksburg that failed. So now what the Union knew is they were in for it. Mm-hmm. They knew that this was not going to be a deal I have to think, Mary, as soon as they saw the terrain and once they saw what they were in for, they had to realize what it's going to be. Now we're going to talk more about Vicksburg later. We're going to talk about Duck River, and we're going to talk about the Yazoo again. We're going to talk about Champion Hill. We're going to talk about Big Black. We're going to talk about all the stuff that goes in Vicksburg. But I think what this told Grant and what this told especially Sherman was this is going to suck but it has to be done. But we don't know how we're going to do it. So the rest of the campaign is going to be stops and starts trying to figure it out. Not to give away the end of the story, Mary, but guess what happens? They eventually get it.
Exactly, they do.
But the story is interesting, though, because it really shows ingenuity that they had to use to get it. And it was very interesting. But it's a fantastic, fantastic lead up to it. I think the Holly Springs attack by Van Dorn is one that does not get enough publicity.
It doesn't,
especially
no.
on the Confederate side.
No, it doesn't. It's one of these things that it has such far-reaching effects. And one of the effects that it has is it forces Grant into a retreat. And in that retreat, he realizes something. So at the time, the weather is cold. It's not great. Grant is worrying that as he's retreating, that his army's not going to be able to be supplied. So his field commander suggests that he organize foraging parties out from an area 15 miles east and west of the main roads from Oxford. And I'm sure this is probably starting to sound familiar to some of our listeners. So what happened is mills for grinding corn were set to work and kept running day and night, and fat stock were driven in and slaughtered by the thousands. This is from the account of one of the soldiers. And Grant said that he was amazed to discover that his army could have subsisted off the country for 2 months instead of 2 weeks. Now, the foraging that happens is two different stories. If you read in Grant's memoirs, he says it's very humane and orderly, but his soldiers do tell a different story. One soldier said that as soon as they had their tent set at night, scores of the boys would strike out with their guns and shoot whatever was eatable. Sergeant Samuel Byers is involved in these foraging and raiding parties in this part of the Vicksburg Campaign, and he would later be on Sherman's March to the Sea. And he described the Mississippi countryside as being blasted by war with barns and houses gone, burned by raiders of both armies. This is the beginnings of what they're realizing is something that can work for an army, that you can march and you can live off the countryside. And this whole idea of going, 15 miles either side, very similar to what's going to happen on the March to the Sea. And that's when the light goes off in Grant's head about this, So you see the beginnings of what happens later in the war happening here. The other thing too that happens that is very similar to the March to the Sea is that slaves are joining in on this too. Sergeant Byers, the same guy I spoke of before, he said that this was his first look at the horrors of slavery. Much like some of the soldiers on the March to the Sea, it was their first look at the horrors of slavery. And by the time Grant crosses back into Tennessee, state officials had estimated that the majority of slaves in the northern border counties, Mississippi, had run away. Miller, in his book about Vicksburg, says that it was not Lincoln's proclamation that was going to free them, it was the army. And that's very similar to what's happening on the March to the Sea as well. So this is another repercussion of what is happening in the Vicksburg Campaign, is that it's causing a social upheaval. It's a threat to the culture of slavery plantation owners, and it's being felt in late 1862 in Mississippi, where 55% of the population is slaves.
Yeah, it's you saw slaves helping the Union and helping the Confederacy, and this story we talked about tonight with whether Holly Springs and Vicksburg with the Confederate soldiers. I've always looked at Vicksburg from a top level is almost like a microcosm of the entire war, right?
Yeah.
It seemed like it was going to be a quick little milk run to take Vicksburg, and then they realized because of terrain, because of defense, because of miscommunication, because of mistakes, that it was going to be hard. And then Union needed to find as many ways possible to actually win it. So if you want to look at the Civil War in just in a quick little shot, look at the Vicksburg Campaign, because it really is kind of in a microcosm of the entire war from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Grant, although he didn't do well at Holly Springs, and it was one of his darker moments, especially with the whole Order Number 11.
The Order 11 and just the whole, just how many millions of dollars of supplies were lost. But again, I think when you look at the big picture of the Civil War, this is kind of like Stone's River. It's not talked about as much because Grant saw Stone's River as not being a victory. Why is he going to talk about Holly Springs? But it changes the game. It is probably why Vicksburg goes on for as long as it does. Because if Grant and Sherman are able to do their two-pronged attack, who knows what could have happened, right?
They would have got the Confederacy.
And at this time, Murfreesboro hasn't been fought, right?
Right. This would have been right on this. It would have been right almost exact same time. Sorry. So, but the difference would have been though is they would have caught the Confederacy in Pemberton with their pants down because they still only had 6,000 guys.
Exactly.
If the timing worked out well, if Van Dorn's raid did not happen and Grant was allowed to attack and pull those troops away and spread them thin, Sherman probably takes the city. Now, whether he could hold the city is a different story. He probably would. I mean, he would have still about 50,000 combined guys. He probably would have. But the Confederacy knew how important Vicksburg was but they got them at that very time. Just like what Stephen Dill said, to your point, they had an opportunity, but they just didn't move fast enough. This is a situation where they just needed that one more division to protect them, but you know what? They got it, and they were able to use them to keep him out of the city. So,
and
right?
so if Van Dorn's raid doesn't happen, or if Murphy actually is not drinking, because the odds are that's what he was doing, if he listens and is able to fortify Holly Springs, somehow get his men ready for these cavalry to fight them, like, who knows, right? Grant might have been able to meet up with Sherman, and who knows what would have happened.
That's why
Holly Springs is one of these things that it's a lot more important than what it's made out to be. And in some ways, I think Holly Springs is the beginning of the Vicksburg campaign.
Because it absolutely is.
This is the game changer.
Now, it would have been it might have been hard for him to hold Holly Springs anyway, because he only had 1,500 guys.
Yeah.
Now, they were infantry, and there's different versus 3,500 cavalry guys. So it still would have been a challenge, but at least they would have been ready. They would have had some kind of defense. But again, if you're right, you want to play the what if game that the people in the Facebook don't like. If that is defended and Van Dorn is pushed away and is forced, first north into Tennessee to get them the hell out of there, then that attack is able to continue along the way it's going to. It very well could have changed it. In Sherman, although Sherman still would have the same issue with the terrain, he had a bad map. So it might have been ugly, but they might have been able to pull it off.
Because Grant would have been there too, right? And that's what he's waiting for.
Grant would have been along the Yallabusha River, and he would have been pulling. Pemberton had to spread his line thin to send troops to fight Grant, and then the difference to fight Sherman. So Sherman had a bunch of guys. He would have allegedly, on paper, run right through them, but the Rebs still had the high ground. They still had the bluffs. They had the guns, and they had the terrain the Union had to deal with. So they probably would have done it, but it would have been a lot harder. Now, if Farragut's guns had weakened them a little bit, had a little more success leading up to that, it might have been a little bit different story. It was probably Sherman's and Grant's worst moment, as far as the worst month probably of their campaign time, with the McClernand thing hanging over both of them, which is in the back of their mind. It ends a pretty shitty month for Lincoln, right?
Because I can't imagine. He's got Fredericksburg, he's got this, he's got like Chickasaw and he's got the whole Jewish problem now. Exactly, but he does have Stones River. But he has Stones River, but don't forget, Grant told him it wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah. So you wonder what was going through his head as he sat down on New Year's as the calendar flipped from 1862 to 1863. And not that to jump ahead, 63 doesn't start too good for the Union either, up until Gettysburg. Right? No. So when you look at starting with December, rolling all the way through until May of 63, that's a shitty 6 months, Mary, for Lincoln. Other than the proclamation. But I mean, Lincoln does believe, Grant doesn't tell him that Stones River is, a failure until 1865. Lincoln is going into 1863 believing he has had this one victory at Stones River. And it makes me wonder that if he still saw it as a victory in 1865, it's pretty significant. I mean, Stones River is a very significant Union victory, as we discussed last week. It's just downplayed. I'm not sure it took that long for Grant to tell him that, though. Looking at Grant, I wonder if he was sending those messages before then because to mask his own issues he was having too. Who knows with Grant. But the reality was Stones River takes on more of an importance when you look at what was surrounding it. When you look at Fredericksburg, when you look at the beginning of Vicksburg, Holly Springs, and this one, and Chickasaw, and then looking ahead. So that's kind of like the shining moment for him. So again, it does take on a bigger significance, like you said, because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah. So it's a fun study because it's trial and error. The mistakes that Grant and Sherman make are going to be tried to rectify throughout it. They try to sail down the old Duck Creek and they all get stuck in the river and they're lucky they didn't get blown up there. And then we'll talk more about that next time. They have that blow up the mine thing. And it's just, there's so many things that happen with Vicksburg. There's so much that happens with it. And it's a joint Navy and infantry thing too, which needs to be, the importance of that needs to be stressed because the Navy kind of gets left behind in the Civil War sometimes. But this is very much Navy infantry effort, and there's a great relationship between Sherman, Grant, Porter, and Farragut in doing this and achieving Vicksburg as well. But I think the one thing to take away from this is that Chickasaw is considered to be the beginning of the Vicksburg campaign, I think, in a lot of Civil War circles. But if you look more at Holly Springs, I think that is where it begins because that is what changes the game for Grant as well. Holly Springs and the retreat that Grant has to do is what starts sowing the seeds for what is going to happen on the march to the sea. I don't think Holly Springs can be dismissed as just a raid. I think it is more than that. I think it is
It's the only cavalry raid that stopped a Union campaign.
Yeah, according to Ed Bars, right? Like it's so
that's what he
significant
says.
in that way, right? Like but it's a joint. Like it's not just Van Dorn's cavalry; it's Forrest as well, because Forrest has been in Tennessee ripping up railways, cutting telegraph lines. He's basically severed all of Grant's communications. They both have, him and Van Dorn have absolutely severed them. Forrest especially was outnumbered by Union troops, and he's able to do all of this. So it is not a shining hour for the Union here at all.
They left with mud in their eye, Mary, no question about it. But speaking of mud, Mary, coming attractions next week, we are going to roll around in the mud, Mary. We are going to talk about Burnside and the Mud March. So coming attractions, as we step out of the Western Theater and go back into the East next week, we're going to talk about Burnside. We're going to talk about Hooker taking over the AOP. We're going to have all kinds of fun talk about that. We're going to talk about mud. So it'll be fun. But I think overall, looking back at this one last time, it's a great study. And I think people, if they study the Vicksburg campaign, there's some great books on Vicksburg. If you read the whole campaign, you'll find that as much as we're giving Grant and Sherman kind of a hard time at the beginning because of the mistakes they made, Grant's campaign at Vicksburg is the most brilliant in American military history once you realize the whole picture. But this is how it starts. So you realize that they were up against the wall at the beginning. So it's a great study. So I enjoyed this. I think it's fun talking about this. And I think we'll have a lot of fun talking about this on our live, Mary, next Saturday.
On Saturday at 10 o'clock. So, actually, if you're listening to this episode, if it's before Saturday at 10 o'clock, which it might be depending on when I get it posted, we hope to see you there. But yeah, as you said, like Grant and Sherman make mistakes at the beginning of this campaign, but I think they recover from those, and it is a very brilliant campaign. And there are a couple of good books that we can recommend. There is Winston Groom's book about Vicksburg, which Darren has read, and then I would really recommend Donald L. Miller's book Vicksburg as well. I haven't read Groom's, but I'm going by Darren's recommendation, and he and I seem to like the same stuff, so I'm going to say it's probably a good book too. But Miller's book is excellent as well. Also, White's biography of Grant, American Ulysses, has a really good recounting of the Vicksburg campaign as well, and same with Gene Edward Smith in his biography of Grant.
We will leave Grant licking his wounds, heading back to Memphis, and Sherman jumping on the boat.
Finding out about McClernand.
Finding out about McClernand giving him that stink eye right now. And we will catch up with them down the road a little bit. But for now, we were going to exit the West and we'll head back to the East. So, Mary, this was a great talk. Enjoyed this very much with you as we sign off on episode 21 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. We'll be moving on to back, like we said before, back to the East as we talk about Burnside. And we talk about mud. And then I'll probably have a good time. We'll have a lot of fun with that.
Name will be Mud.
Ooh, I see what you did there. Okay.
Anyway, guys, have a terrific Saturday, and hope to see you on our live.
And that's it. We'll put a bow on this one, Mary.
Yep. Okay. See you guys later.
All right. Peace out, everybody.
Okay. Bye.